Well, hello, and thank you for attending tonight. I'm very excited. Great to see you all braving a tornado warning earlier this evening. We are in the middle of an exhibition called American Revolutionaries, Art and Disruption. In this exhibition, we have about 160 years of American art. Included in the exhibition is, of course, the work of the great Canadian-American painter, Philip Guston. And with me tonight, I have a treat for you from the St. Louis Art Museum, the curator of modern and contemporary art since 2010, and also having published extensively. I won't go into all the publications. They are quite numerous, most recently focusing on Edward Manet and Vincent van Gogh, and previously working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and originally from just north of London, right? Essex, essentially. Here in Peoria, please welcome Simon Kelly.
All right, thank you, Bill. Can you hear me okay? This is a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be in Peoria. It's my first visit to the city and the museum, and Bill's given me a wonderful welcome. Everly too. So yeah, I wasn't expecting it to be a tornado warning just after I arrived. But
we bring out all the stops. For
yeah, we get them in St. Louis as well. So I wanted to. Just show an image of Philip Guston at the beginning. So, one of the interesting things about Guston is that he does have a connection to the Midwest, a strong connection to the Midwest. He taught at the University of Iowa for 4 years from 1941 until 1945, and then was in St. Louis at Washington University from 1945 to 47. Did he come to Peoria? I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, I'm
quite
interested
sure. To know if he did. But anyway, he did spend a lot of time in the Midwest, and just before that, a little bit about his history. I mean, his birth name is Philip Goldstein. He came from a Jewish family who'd actually emigrated from Odessa in Ukraine, and they moved to Canada. He was born in Montreal in 1913, and then he moved with his family to Los Angeles in 1919. So he grew up in California, and he grew up in California actually against a sort of background of persecution for his family. There was, but there was at that time, the Ku Klux Klan it wasn't just in the South, but it was also in California quite prominently. So he grew up against having, his family encountering quite a bit of persecution because of their Jewish background. And his father actually committed suicide, and it's often said that it was as a result of that persecution. So that's kind of an important background to some of this later work and the Ku Klux Klansman subject matter that we see in the exhibition here.
Simon, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do we see any of that? Do we see any of predilection of that type of subject matter prior to the figurative paintings at all that we have not got to yet, but do we see any of that in his work?
Yeah, we do. I mean, there's a lot of that, and some of the paintings from the 30s have been destroyed, but in the 30s, he's producing a lot of, and he's very politically active, left wing, and works which do engage with the Klan at that point. So there's a lot of paintings in the 30s which represent Klan figures in a very sort of critical way from his perspective. So that's an important, that engagement in the 30s is a really important context for the work that you see in this show. I'll show one or two in a second. So that is. Do you want to talk about this painting now, or do you want to? I mean, we can. I mean, it's an interesting work because it is. This is a moment that he's turning to this. This kind of subject matter, or turning back to it, you could say. and before that time, he'd been known, principally for his engagement with the New York school. He really made his name in the 50s and 60s through his abstract paintings, his abstract expressionist paintings. And when he started to paint work like this in 1969 and exhibited it in 1970, he was seen as kind of betraying the essential ideals of the New York school. And he lost a lot of supporters, a lot of friends, actually. He had a close friend called Morton Feldman, who was a composer who never spoke to him again after he exhibited these works. So it was quite a controversial step to take to start to show this painting.
The advent of pop art at that time is really gaining momentum. He's seeing, obviously, pop art probably emboldening his decision to move toward figuration. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of the sort of formal approach in this, he was really influenced by underground comics in the 1960s. There's an illustrator called Robert Crumb who was doing these images of, probably best known, Felix the Cat. But that particular language is one which, Guston is appropriating here. To me, there's a difference between Guston and pop art, though, because there's not the kind of sort of distance and irony in Guston's work that you find in some of pop art. There's a lot of this work is very engaged and self-reflexive.
No, I totally agree. I think, again, kind of emboldening this decision to move into figuration from this, what is now kind of being seen in 1969 as a little bit of a dinosaur, moving away from the art world, the New York school, abstract expressionism, and but certainly I totally agree. I think it was such a bold move that we're still discussing it today. It's still kind of a strange, it's an anomaly within that grouping of painters that, with the exception of Willem de Kooning, who always held the figure a little bit, this is probably the main example that one would hold of that type of abandoning the great American art movement.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned de Kooning, because when this exhibition, the exhibition of the figurative work was shown in 1970. It was shown at the Marlborough Gallery in New York, in Manhattan. So de Kooning was one of the few artists who actually responded favorably to this work, and he talked to Guston about the freedom that Guston was showing in producing this kind of work, and he respected Guston for that. A lot of other artists in the New York school did not like this direction he was taking. But in general, I mean, I think, part of this work, I think it's important to understand Guston's personal history, and I referenced that a little bit earlier on. But it's also important just to think about what's happening in America at this time, and that this is what Guston was responding to. 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, the police violence against protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, which Guston was quite shocked by. So he's kind of responding to what he's seeing in American society and the kind of underlying racism that he still sees within the society. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan wasn't as prevalent in the late 60s as it was in the 30s, but it was still, racism was obviously an element of society, and that this is what this figure, Guston's kind of anti-hero, if you like, this Klansman figure who appears again and again in these paintings is kind of referencing. And another interesting thing about this work, and Bill, might want to talk about this too, is that Guston did talk about these paintings as self-portraits. And that's something that, even though he had this history of, family persecution, and his daughter has also talked about this, Musa, she talked about these paintings as being a sort of reference to white culpability, and that was something that Guston was trying to engage with. The way, how do you engage, as a white person with with that very current history of racism in America at that time.
So this is an important exhibition, this 1969 exhibition, the Marlborough, where a lot of these images are coming from.
Yeah.
The even the oversized hand, which becomes quite repeated motif, is pointed like a gun. The turrets for the eyes. There are a lot of kind of interesting bits of aggression that he hides away in these very friendly, almost cartoonish approaches. Is what is known about what he's thinking about at this time?
I mean, there are some quote. I mean, there's a great quote where he talks in, I think it's either 69 or 70. He says, he's thinking about what's happening in history, and he's talking about he uses the word brutality, the brutality of life, and he's like, how can I still be painting in my studio, and adjusting a red to a blue, right? That's the kind of the term he uses. How can I continue with the abstraction that I'm doing? What was called pure painting at the time, when there's this turmoil happening in America, and he also uses there's another term he uses later on in terms of this kind of work, which he talks about his term from pure painting to impure painting, and it's impure because it's engaging with the impurity of American society. So I think that's I think that's kind of what he's thinking. It's a turn back to history in a way, and contemporary society.
And yet, I'm always intrigued by, and we can move to maybe some of the other images that were included in that exhibition, but the centrality of that particular image, the cigar image, which comes directly out of that abstract language. There are a lot of what he has, he has little leftovers of the abstract expressionists in the smoke of the cigar, and as Simon and I were noting earlier, and please look at the painting closely after we're finished, little bit of artifact edit underneath the hand, which is the only place in this painting he allows that to be seen. So there are these little fragments of the New York school that are just hanging on.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, because often they're seen as being this dichotomy between Guston's abstraction and figuration, but actually there is a lot more continuity, and you do I see a lot of abstraction in these figurative works, and in the same way, actually, in some of the abstract works, you see figuration. So it's more complex. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these. I mean, so many of these paintings, from around this time show a figure smoking, and again, I think that's very autobiographical because Guston was, such a heavy smoker himself.
All the photographs, always a cigarette in his hand. This is one that is in our permanent collection and is also included in the show. Thank you for putting that in here.
Yeah, I mean, this one it's interesting because I'll show one or two installation shots of the show we have in St. Louis, but this one's interesting to me because he does this motif of the disembodied feet or legs. I mean, that appears again and again. And again, I see that as referencing history, and he'd seen photographs of concentration camps and the Holocaust, and these reference. I mean, some of these paintings are pretty dark. They are. Sorry to be kind of a bit of a dad, but that's what makes him interesting, actually. And I read some of these. This focus on feet and shoes as having a personal connection to a lot of his work is very autobiographical, and his brother had his when he was a boy had his legs run over and his feet seriously damaged, and that was that personal history was one which also impacted this choice of motif, I think.
I've always been intrigued by the similarity of the shoes and the bricks. And I've always read them both as kind of similarly bodily. Is and weighty and
Yeah, I can see that, yeah.
and not full of life.
Right. No, I mean, I don't disagree with that. And I think, as we go through the slides, you'll see that in other works, and also a sort of interesting dialogue between the prints and the paintings. Where you'll see these similar similar motifs to the one that you have in your print here.
Before you switch, sorry,
Let's go back. Yeah.
We'll get to it again, but I'm intrigued by the stitching motif that he almost marries all this imagery together with. So the bricks have a similar type of indication of some kind of surface. The windows similarly stitched, obviously through the shoes. Anything to make particularly of this, or is this just a motif? Is this part of the language that he maybe impulsively and just acquires through the use of figuration?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have great insights to that, I'm afraid. I mean, I think it's interesting to see the stitching on the on the hood of the Klansman, and we'll see it again and again, as we go through the images. But I don't know. I mean, it strikes me, and when we look at it here, as having quite a strongly kind of minimalist dimension to it. So, Guston. I mean, it's not like he wasn't aware of what was happening in the minimalist world at this time. So maybe it could be a reference to that in some way. So this is the relatively small exhibition we have in St. Louis at the moment. We do have because of Guston's connection to St. Louis, he taught at Washington University, as I said. He lived in the city for 2 years. That's encouraged the history of collecting his work, and we have we have 5 paintings by him in the museum, one of which is on loan to the retrospective at the moment, the earliest painting we have. And we also just got gifted another painting by Emily Pulitzer. So that the gift from Emily is kind of the rationale for doing this show at the moment. And I just, this is one or two installation shots, and this show, even though it's relatively small, does cover a pretty wide range of Guston's career. And it does kind of what Bill was saying. It does actually help in seeing those continuities between the abstraction and figuration in his work. And I'll show close-up images of these as well.
These are probably 20-year intervals, between 25-year intervals?
Yeah, well, the one on the right is 64, and the one on the left is 75.
Okay.
And then when the one on the left here is 57, this is room 112. So that year, 57, that period of Guston's work is the one that, in terms of the market, has attracted the highest prices. So I think the sale record for Guston's about 25 million for a painting for around that date. And then the one next to this is from Ancient Painter from early 73, I think. So it is a pretty interesting range of work in the show. And we can talk about Dark Room, which is a very late painting from 78 from Emmy's collection. And then I wanted to mention this. Any of you seen this show, just out of curiosity? Because this is part of the context of all of this. This was a show that was postponed because of the controversy around Guston's subject matter, and that became controversial in itself. The postponement, a lot of artists in particular were not particularly happy at that decision. But now I'm happy to say that the show is happening and has been happening for a while. So it opened at the MFA Boston and was recently in Houston, and is currently at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And it's a pretty spectacular show. It is very different, and in terms of the way it's presented, different in its venues.
And that halting was as a result of a careful re-examination of the intentions of Guston through the use of this very tense and raw imagery of the hoods and so forth.
Right. Yeah. And it was in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, and it was a difficult moment. But I'm glad that there's a lot we could say about that in terms of whether that was a good or bad decision. But I think the important thing is now that the show is happening, and yeah, I mean, it's a spectacular show actually, and it covers every period of Guston's career, because that's this early work is from the 30s, which often gets overlooked. is fascinating, and he started off really as a muralist. He was very influenced by a lot of the Mexican muralists, people like Siqueiros and Rivera. On the left, I put these in because what I was saying right at the beginning, that early on in his career he was often treating Klansman subjects, and that kind of spoke to his own personal history in California. So the one on the left has often been reproduced, and that shows the hanging of a young black man by a group of Klansmen. So it's quite a shocking subject actually. And then the one next to it here is actually a mural. I don't know if I can. Yeah, so it's a mural. So the one on the right is actually the mural that Guston made, and it shows the whipping by a Klansman of a young black man. And this was he's young when he's painting these. He's in his teens, and in the case of the one on the right, 20. But this mural was actually defaced by Klansmen. And again, that experience of having his work defaced is, also is an important background to his later work. And he would continue to produce socially engaged paintings, often on a pretty large scale, murals through the 30s. Some really impressive work in Mexico, for example. So that I think that's an important part of his practice. And then this is a little bit later when he's moving towards easel painting. So these are the one on the left is in the St. Louis Art Museum, and this is when he's doing these paintings of children, but they become allegories for the wider socio-political situation, particularly what's happening with the war, World War II on the left. These children sort of fighting in the street, and then the one on the right is actually quite a shocking subject when you start to look into it. This is interesting as well because, Guston was instrumental in Max Beckmann coming to St. Louis in 1947. And there's quite a few similarities between Guston and Beckmann's work in terms of their, the complexity of the symbolism. So, the Guston painting on the right, again, is pretty dark, and it references, the Holocaust and concentration camps. You can see the figure on the bottom left here. I can show that. Go back.
Yeah, we really see the Mexican muralist influence.
Yeah, but that is referenced in the concentration camps. So.
Wow.
So this is a powerful work, and this is in the current show in what is now in Washington. So at this time, his work is very different to the painting that you have in the show. It's more in a more kind of social realist vein.
Almost Goya-esque.
He was interested in Goya. I mean, that's another thing about Guston. He was such a student of art history. He spent a lot of time in Italy as well. He loved artists like Piero della Francesca, Uccello, but certainly Goya was an artist who deeply influenced him. There's so much we could say about this work, which is probably not the time to do it. But there's a lot. If you come to St. Louis, it's worth looking at. The masks they're wearing, the references to African masks. I think that's his young daughter, who's kind of like a ray of light, just here looking out at the composition.
Wow. The masks and the hats
masks are just crazy.
Already there.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So this is St. Louis. Once he gets to St. Louis in 45, And this is when he's moving to, so he moves to New York around 1950, and he really becomes an important part of the scene in New York. Robert Motherwell is the one who coins the term the New York School, which is really, that was a term that Guston preferred. He didn't really like the term abstract expressionism. He preferred the term New York School, because he felt the movement really was grounded in place, particularly New York, of course. So this. And he was a heavy drinker as well as being a heavy smoker, so he was always, going out to the Cedar Bar, the Cedar Tavern, and here you can see him with de Kooning, who was a close friend of his, Mercedes Matter. That's Frank O'Hara in the background.
And
I'm
Elaine.
going to say this, yeah. So we have there's a print in this exhibition, which is is it a gift?
It's a promise gift.
Promise gift.
Yeah.
It's a lithograph by Guston, right, illustrating the Ode to Michael Goldberg, a poem by Frank O'Hara. So Guston, and Guston was always, a lot of his circle. It wasn't just artists; he knew a lot of poets, writers, composers, and you kind of see that in this photograph here. And then in the back right is Elaine de Kooning. And that's another thing. I have this show in St. Louis at the moment, which is looking at Joan Mitchell. Just the importance of women to the abstract expressionist movement in the 50s was just kind of seminal. And Elaine de Kooning was an important part of that. And this is an early Time magazine article when he's starting to get a bit more press attention. Starting to sell his work. And this is the kind, I don't know how familiar you are with this kind of work, but this is the kind of painting that really made his name in the 50s. It was what was called abstract impressionism at the time. It wasn't just abstract expressionism. He was often compared to Monet, which he didn't particularly like, but people compared his palette, the sort of pinks and reds, to Monet's water lily paintings. This cadmium red, you see a lot in his paintings of the 50s. But he builds up these rather kind of delicate, sort of lattice-like effects in these paintings, and this one's called Beggar's Joys from 1954 to 5.
That soutine red, the meat almost like very fleshy and violent, really, which, as you mentioned, he begins to reappropriate into the late work.
Right, and this one is St. Louis as well. This is a Pulitzer gift, and this is a little bit later. The color is starting to expand a little bit. He's kind of exploring the sort of dynamic or dialogue between center and edge. That's something that you see a lot in these works. And I think in these paintings, you think about what does abstract expressionism really mean. And he was interested. He sort of falls more within the action painting, side of the group rather than the color field associated with Rothko. But he's thinking about the act of painting, the gesture as an index of personal subjectivity of his of his selfhood, and he's thinking about what is unique about paint. Right, these are not obviously representational, so the focus is on the viscosity of paint and the complexity of color in these works, rather than a focus on trying to actually represent anything. And if you see, this work in person, you'll see just how dense and viscous, the paint is.
And much like Cigar, we have that space that surrounds that centrality of active brushwork and content that's happening in the more central part of the painting. That goes away over time, but it's fascinating to see him hold that these images kind of hover, and there's something about that these images, they emerged in the pictures. They are not edge to edge, almost dreamlike or emanating from another place.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because it does you know, a lot of painters at this time are doing all-over paintings, but the fact that he's allowing the canvas to show through around the edge does add a, you know, an extra layer of spatial complexity to the work. And then this is interesting. So this is getting into the 60s. And again, you know, people start, you know, often this period is still seen as being pretty abstract, but, you know, he called this painting Head One, and there is a pretty obvious connection to figuration in this one, in the sort of, you know, silhouetted form, which only he actually calls the painting Head. So, he's not hiding the reference to figuration.
It's as if he's floating the idea out there
right,
to see if it
literally floating, right? Yeah. And again, like this one, you're seeing a lot of the canvas showing through, and then this one is in the show in St. Louis. And the family, his daughter, you know, Musa Meyer has been Musa has been a big, you know, supporter of his work. She's, you know, head of the foundation and continues. She's written a biography of her father and continues to be a, you know, great supporter of her father's memory.
Phenomenal book, Night Studio.
It's a great book, absolutely, yeah. And then I just wanted to mention this because your painting, you know, needs to be seen within the context of this exhibition. It was part of the exhibition of about 30 paintings at the Marlborough Gallery in New York in 1970, and that's the one that I was saying that, you know, it was so controversial. I mean, the quote that's often said is that Hilton Kramer, who was a famous critic at the time, described Guston, in his words, as a Mandarin pretending to be a stumble bum. A Mandarin pretending to be a stumble bum. And that was all about, you know, portraying the high ideals of, you know, the purity of, you know, of the abstract expressionist movement to instead, you know, paint these works which engage with the, you know, complexity of history, but also in that sort of comic book style, that caricatural style, which was also controversial alongside the, you know, the subject matter.
Sure. And the painting on the right, very much like the street print, with not only the falling objects, but the hand holding something. There's always something, there's some kind of activity, some kind of human intervention. And we are unsure whether that is a constructive or destructive.
That's right.
And sometimes it's the painter, and sometimes it's we're not totally clear what the human is up to, what the hand is up to in these.
Right, that's true. There it is again.
What do you? We talk not to obsess on those little dots, but on this,
the stitches,
But on this one, it is so unusual. I mean, not unusual in his work, but it, to me, is one of the most fascinating parts of the painting. Is this almost like a side of beef, carving out different portions of himself or of the protagonist or antagonist.
Right. No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think, you know, it's quite interesting to compare the way that he does treat the hoods in different paintings, and I think here you're right. I mean, in this particular painting, the stitching is very evident. In some of the other ones, you can see, you know, touches of blood, for example, which is you don't see in this one, but that's also another kind of interesting element. I think when I was looking at this painting, when I'd seen the reproduction, I thought the background was just, you know, prime white canvas. But I was saying to you, when I looked at it, it's actually all painted white. It's kind of interesting. Right. So the whole painting is actually covered in paint. And then, you know, the bricks in the background as well, they're also an important part of the composition. That's another motif that you see again and again, as you mentioned. So this is probably one of the most famous, from that exhibition, the studio. And I mentioned earlier that, Guston talked about these paintings as being, self-portraits, and he said that he wanted to try to understand evil when he was painting these works. And this is again, you can see. Is this? I'm trying to see if the figure is smoking. Yes, you can see that. You can see this. You can see the cigar, the cigarette. Yeah, you can, right? So, so again, that element, which is a reference. I mean, obviously, the painting is a reference to him working in his studio, but also the fact that he's holding a cigarette or cigar. So I think this is quite an autobiographical work again.
Probably referring to the Red Studio by Matisse in some ways.
Possibly, yeah.
And also a brilliant colorist with that shade, that green shade, which just turns this red completely on.
Yeah.
This is such an exciting painting. Every time I see it, it moves me. The vertical marks of the brushes and the hash marks that repeat down below become very aggressive as well. And the blood. There's
right,
a little bit in this one.
Exactly. And then this one I put in because it has a little bit of the kind of minimalism of your painting. So I thought this was interesting to, and again the figure with the cigar and the smoke, as being rather similar in this work. So I think it would have been, I think Guston never thought about the painting in your show. I don't think he thought about it as a unique work. He thought about it in the context of the other paintings.
What we're seeing here is the beginning of these isolated motifs, though. So we have the hood, we have the figure, we have the hand, we have the cigarette. But now we're seeing chairs and lamps soon, of course, light bulbs and eyeballs. And he starts to kind of, what do you think? He's almost as if dissecting the world around him or dissecting himself somehow.
I don't know. I mean, it's true that he's building his own kind of personal symbolism, and you do see these, particular motifs that recur again and again. I mean, we'll see. I've already showed some of them. The disembodied legs, for example.
Right.
But I think each of them did have a particular meaning for him. We can maybe talk about that as we go through. And this is the blackboard painting that was in the installation shot that I showed. And then this, there's quite most of the time he presents these Klansmen as sort of, kind of bumbling, caricatural figures, and, it's not a particularly, flattering surname. I think that's part of the interest of these works. And it has been pointed out that in these paintings, unlike some of the earlier works, you don't see explicit racial violence in these ones. So I think that's also something else to note. And then we're sort of moving on a little bit later. Guston has this show at the Marble Gallery in 1970, and then soon after he gets a 6-month fellowship to go and study in Rome. I think he's at the American Academy there, and that really allows him to embrace more fully his interest in the art of the past. He'd always been interested in Renaissance art and classical art. Particularly figures like Piero della Francesca, Paolo Uccello, but also classical, art going back to Roman times. And this painting, I think, in some ways reflects that. It's called Ancient Painter. You can see the figure painting to the hand, the sort of disembodied hands, painting this form on the right.
Also see him walking back to abstraction a little more heavily here.
I mean, actually you can. I mean, when you see this painting in person, the sort of lushness of the pinks is it looks like straight out of a painting from the 1960s, actually. So that again, it sort of reinforces that point about the the continuing dialogue between abstraction and figuration in his work. And I don't know if these are kind of supposed to be conversation bubbles there. I don't know why they would be there for a hand, but it's sort of not exactly clear exactly what's happening. And then this is 75. This is called Allegory. So Guston was always interested in the role of the artist within society, and not just the artist. The painter, or rather the composer, the sculptor, the poet. So you got those different elements represented in this painting. So, you know, Bill, you were sort of mentioning that around, you know, the early 70s, Guston starts to present himself in another alter ego, which is kind of this Cyclops-like figure with this sort of bulbous eye. So that's actually Guston there. And then just here, this is Morton Feldman, who was a composer, who was a close friend of Guston. He's the one who didn't speak to Guston again after the 1970 show. This is Raoul Hogue, who was a sculptor friend of his. And he's actually kind of, looks like he's whipping.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost kind of self-flagellation here.
Yeah.
And this is actually a reference to a Piero della Francesca painting of flagellation. And here, this is, I'm not exactly, this could be like a steering wheel. Yeah, I think this is probably a steering wheel. You can see here the brushes, you know, touches of color. And then in the just at the top here, this is actually a reference to his Guston's wife, Musa, who was a poet. So you just see the top of her head, so you can see the different, you know, types of artists represented. You know, actually spelt out literally at the bottom here, and then I guess this is sort of a reference to the hand of God, arguably the first artist. Yeah, right. And then all these different elements here, the sort of geometrical elements. So there's also a reference to Dürer's print here, Melancholia, which Guston loved and hung in his home. You know, with these figures here and the sort of allegorical levels of meaning in that one. So there's a lot going on in this painting. And again, you've got the, you know, the disembodied feet, legs. You know, when I talked about the different, you know, both personal and historical meanings going on there.
And the reference to the Melancholia print, we've alluded to it, but haven't really got into this self-loathing that seems to creep into Guston's particularly late work. I mean, you've kind of alluded to it, but there is a true sadness in many of these when he is, and I don't know if we have one, but often he is prostrate and completely without the ability, seemingly, to paint or to do anything.
Right.
And those are terribly affecting.
Yeah, I agree with
pictures.
You. I can't remember if I included one of those. Let me see. Not exactly, but I put these in just to, again, you know, Guston's work has to be seen as a whole, and you know, all of these works have some kind of complementary. So you can see, you know, the hand of God appears here. In this one, this is Musa again at the bottom left, and again that similar flagellation image appears in a contemporary painting. This is kind of interesting. I mean, he was so interested in just you know, the different elements of actually being a painter, and then this is, you can see the eye in the center, which is kind of a, I guess, synecdoche for the, you know, for him for actually being an artist.
It's an eye in a painting,
right?
Or exactly. A painting of an eye.
Yeah,
I guess.
Exactly. And the light bulb, you can see at top left. That's and there was some kind of personal reference. He talked at one point when he was a young child about you know, spending time sitting in a cupboard, having a light bulb there and drawing away, and actually it's a space of kind of retreat. So that's what, you know, you were kind of alluding to it, but a lot of these images that recur again and again in his work have personal meanings, but also broader, often broader, you know, socio-historical meanings too. And then the bulb reappears again here, the light bulb, although here it's not really illuminating the room. So this is called Dark Room. A lot of Guston's late works not only focus on what it means to be a painter, but they also focus on the studio, right? So, you know, he moves to 1967, he moves to a studio in Woodstock in upstate New York, and a lot of his late work, you know, focuses on his studio, and this is an example of that. So you can see the arm coming in from the left. I mean, it's not clear. I think it's probably holding a brush. It could be holding a cigarette. I think it probably is a brush, actually. And you can see the book on the table. Is that like a watch kind of embedded in his wrist? So there are some questions here. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about the stitches, because sometimes there is a kind of underlying geometry which appears in some of these works. The way that the floor is represented here is a kind of reference to that, I think.
Have you made any personal deductions regarding any of these little motifs? The light bulb, does it mean any idea? I mean, I'm sure you have your own ideas.
I'm not sure. I mean, I actually, I guess I've been struck by the fact that, the light bulb there is so prominent within the room, but it's not actually spreading light. So what is that? I don't know. I haven't really thought too much about what that signifies, but there is a sort of underlying darkness and pessimism to these late works. Maybe something to do with light or reason as having its limits. I don't know. I mean, it's Guston himself is pretty elliptical about what these late works might mean. Again, this one is gives some kind of context. It shows a similar kind of arm. This time the cigarette smoke is obviously much more visible. But here the cigarettes, here, is this a cigarette? Is it a brush in our painting? Again, I'm sort of leaning more towards a brush at the moment, but it's never completely clear.
And the smoke becomes even more visceral and organic, we'll say.
Right. And then there's yours, but I think we also have. Yeah, so I included this one in. So we have this print in our collection in St. Louis. So it's actually quite an interesting counterpoint to yours. 1980, right at the end of his life, he again produces an interesting series of lithographs, and actually the focus on the disembodied feet is quite an interesting counterpoint to the one that you have in your show. And I wanted to show this one because this is in the collection of. This is not a promised gift. But it's in the collection of Emily Pulitzer, and this is such a great painting. It's enormous, So again, there's always this dialogue between his work in different media. He's a great draftsman, but a lot of the subjects in his drawings and prints also appear in his paintings. So I think just going through these works, you do get a sort of an interesting idea of the shifts in his work, going right from the early paintings, the sort of Mexican muralist influence paintings of the 30s and 40s, then that shift to abstraction in the 60s and 70s, and then, or in the 50s and 60s rather, and then in the 70s, the turn back to figuration and the more caricatural work. I mean, I can't really think of it. Can you think of an artist who goes through that similar kind of progression at this time? It's difficult.
Readily.
It's difficult because, a lot of the other artists I've looked at in our collection, they often they fall on a particular approach. I mean, arguably somebody like Ellsworth Kelly, and kind of refine that and stick to it. But I think it's interesting that Guston is willing to, to push in very different directions, and often at the risk to his. Both his commercial and critical reputation.
Bryce Martin made some pretty bold shifts, but
not
from abstraction to figuration, completely a different.
Yeah, not to the same extent as Guston, I think. So yeah, I mean, I think for that reason, I think it is. It's great that you have this painting in your show because it does open up these important conversations, both in terms of how artists progress in their output, but also the way that art at this time can engage with wider narratives of history and what's happening in American society.
And ending on that image reminds me of how horrific Guston's vision can be. Some of these paintings can be.
Yeah, I mean, they're very dark. The paintings are very dark. I mean, they have obviously the language has a connection to to comic books, as I said, but yes, I mean these are deeply deeply pessimistic paintings, I think. So.
Phenomenal.
Do you have any
That was a
questions?
lot.
I don't know. I feel like
That
we're
was a
going,
lot.
this is getting very dark
I
here, but it's
thoroughly enjoyed that.
It's you know, yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think he was interested in time and different, kinds of time. That's something that Beckman was interested too. Max Beckman was not just the kind of time that we read on a wristwatch, but but other kinds of time that might transcend our wristwatch understanding, if you like. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say Guston is going to do that, because I'm not sure I necessarily see the same layers of metaphysical meaning in Guston's work as I do in Beckman. I don't know. I actually don't have a good answer to that question. Do you have a good answer? I mean, it's an interesting point.
It's as mysterious as everything else in his paintings, and I think my opinion is, I think he loves taking you to the precipice and giving you just enough that you kind of get a sense of space, or a sense of narrative, or a sense of movement in terms of beginning to end. But then he just suspends you. He rarely does he bring anything to any kind of real culmination. There's nothing saying, good job, you got it. And that suspension, I would suggest, is a leftover from the New York School years, which that approach to the sublime, the reaching for something so illustrative in terms of knowledge through painting. That attempt to do that always leaves you with a question at the end. And so the clocks often have one hand. Sometimes they go nowhere. Sometimes they're and so my interpretation has always been that just you are suspended in this mysterious world of his, continually looking for the dots to connect, metaphorically and literally.
It's interesting that the early work, that sometimes there's a connection with surrealism, actually. And that, now think of that sort of, when you look at people like Dali and the way he thinks about time, and I think, again, just sometimes there's a dreamlike dimension to these works, which is another way of understanding time, which goes beyond sort of rational, our rational knowledge, if you like. And so maybe that's something, just another area to think about.
Was he obsessed over his own mortality? Do we know anything about?
I mean, I think he was very conscious of his mortality, because he'd had illness through the 70s. He was starting to get pretty sick, and he died relatively young. He was 67 when he died. But yes, I mean, I think in his correspondence in the 70s, he is talking about his concerns about his health, and he died of a heart attack. 67. He was quite a young man. But yes, I mean, I think. Yes, I mean, I think you can see it as an element. Yeah.
Extrapolate as you.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
How about other questions? Anybody? That means we were thorough.
I don't know if we were thorough, really. I feel there's a lot more to discuss, but
well, what an amazing presentation, and such a stimulating discussion. I had so much fun, Simon. I can't thank you enough for being here in Peoria. I cannot thank, and I would be remiss to not mention again, Crystal Bridges and the Art Bridges Foundation for making the loan of Cigar through this grouping of 160 years of American art possible. Our Visionary Society members, we cannot thank enough. We can't do this without you. And we hope to have you back very soon.
I'd like to come back, and we're talking about Guston in this presentation, but just walking around about the 5 minutes I had before we did this, it was interesting to see some of the other works. The Warhol electric chair, with the way that's engaging with, the darker side of American society. That's, in some ways, that's an interesting kind of counterpoint to what Guston is doing, and it also complicates maybe the sort of more conventional ideas we have about Warhol. I love that Jack Whitten you have there, that lap saying, and again, he's a bit like different to Guston, but he's also experimenting. He's a great, technical experimenter, Jack Whitten, and you see, he's like doing what Gerhard Richter is doing. He's doing it in '74. So that's it's an interesting group of work you have here.
Great things.
Yeah.
Simon, thank you. And thank you for everybody for attending tonight through the...
Thanks for braving the weather.
the dark weather. So please come back, and we should spend a little bit of time with the Philip Guston before you leave. So,
and come, if you get a chance, come to St. Louis for both the Guston show and the Monty Mitchell. The Monty Mitchell is on in St. Louis until June the 25th. And we're the only venue in America that's showing that exhibition. It was just at the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris. And it got like 700,000 visitors there, so we're trying to get that in St. Louis. We're not going to get it, but we're doing pretty well there so far. It's attracting a lot of interest, and the Guston show is a smaller complement to that.
I'm going, so let's carpool.
Let me know. Yeah, it's not that far. I drove up today. It took about 2 hours.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great.